This is Randal Schwartz, host of FLOSS Weekly. Coming up next, we're going to talk about a new revolutionary web framework. Co-host is Seigo. We're going to be talking about Lift. Stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for FLOSS Weekly is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is FLOSS Weekly with Randal Schwartz and Seigo. Episode 125 for June 23rd, 2010. The Lift Web Framework. It's time for FLOSS Weekly, the free, libre, open-source software show that comes on weekly. We get to talk to some of the leaders, the movers, the shakers, and even sometimes some projects you might not have heard of yet, but need to hear of. This is great. I am Randal Schwartz, your host, who forgot to introduce myself last week, but that's okay. My name's in the credits anyway, so it all works out. Speaking of host, we have a co-host. This show, I've got to tell you, though, was arranged at the very last second. I thought I was going to have a different sort of show for this week, and I'm at Columbus, Ohio this week at YAPSE at another Perl conference, so it was all kind of busy with all that. But we do actually have a show put together for you, and we have a last-minute special co-host. You've heard him before right here on this show, Seigo. Come on, Aaron.
Hey, how's it going, Randal? Good to be here again.
Good to be. Good. Thanks for stepping up at the last minute. This is great because I know it's like I said, I thought I had a show lined up and then that all sort of fell apart. And so here we are with this show. But this is a great show. I know it's going to be a great show. You know why I know it's going to be a great show? Because it's about web frameworks. My favorite topic, web frameworks. In particular, this framework.
I used to make my money doing that, working with
Really?
web frameworks. Yeah,
Really?
yeah. Years before I did KDE stuff. Yeah.
What did you use?
You'll like the answers. I used Perl originally.
Yay!
Wrote one app, I think, was almost 15,000 lines of Perl back in the late 90s.
Okay.
And yeah, up until the early 2000s, that's what I worked on. So I'm really curious to see what Lift is going to bring us, some almost 10 years after I stepped out of that field. See what the state of the art is.
And in fact, that's the show we have. We have Lift, the Lift Web Framework. We have none other than David Pollack coming on, who is he lists himself as the benevolent dictator for life for this project. So I'm pretty sure he's up to the task, but we'll have to ask him about that. And also, the other thing that's unusual about this framework is not just yet another framework. I think it's the biggest framework in a language called Scala. And if I did my research right on Scala, it's a functional programming layer placed over the top of or compiling down to the Java virtual machine. So basically you use Java VMs in the back end, maybe like Tomcat and stuff to run it. And then this is a different language that's apparently easier to use and more fun and more functional or whatever. So we'll have to ask about that as well. So that sounds like the kind of show we're going to have today. Are you ready to get started, Aaron?
Absolutely. Strap us in and let's go.
Very good. So let's go ahead and get David Pollack on the line. David, hello.
Hi there. How you doing?
Doing good. Where are we speaking to you from?
I'm in San Francisco right now.
San Francisco. Cool. That's actually not very far from where Leo normally is when he's taping this show. But I'm a long ways away from you. I'm in Columbus, Ohio. And I believe our co-host, Aaron, you're in Vancouver, right?
Yeah, in Vancouver. And it's actually sunny outside today for a change. So hurrah for that. Very
good. Well, David, I tried to introduce, probably very poorly, Lift at the beginning of the show. Can you give us sort of first the 30,000-foot view of what Lift is all about?
Sure. Lift is a web framework that gives you the best of a lot of different worlds. It gives you the best of the conciseness and developer productivity world of Ruby on Rails. It gives you the best of the performance and scalability world of Java or JVM based web frameworks. And it gives you the best of some of the academic things like functional reactive programming and that sort of thing. So what you wind up getting is wicked productive developers, wicked scalable systems, and systems that are secure by default so that developers don't have to work extra hard or add a security layer on at the end.
Well, I think you answered part of this already, but I just want to go back to the beginning. What was the itch you were trying to scratch and which brought you to say, oh, let's just go ahead and create another framework?
because the world just needs another web framework.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, what the world needs now is another folk singer like I Need a Hole in the Head. So I had done a couple of years of Ruby on Rails coding, and I was, before that I had done a lot of Java coding. And Java by 2000, 2001 had become an incredibly heavyweight language, lots of boilerplate. You basically needed an IDE to code in Java. And I've always been, for better or for worse, an Emacs guy.
Yay, Emacs.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. So, yeah, my geek stripes there.
Okay.
So I started looking for something in 2004 that was going to give me a lot more productivity, allow me to get what was up here, what was in my mind's eye, out onto the keyboard, onto the screen, so I could share it with other users. And I came and started using Rails, and it was just a tremendously good experience. I mean, I was able to crank out fully functional websites in, dozens of hours. And working with a core team of people that I had mind melds with, we were able to just do tremendous things. But then I started seeing some of the dark sides of both Ruby and Rails. And bringing Ruby into a shop where you have Java developers who are used to type safety, who are used to a type system and a compiler that make sure that you're not making some stupid mistakes, ones that if you've come up in Ruby land, you're used to writing tests for, but if you've come up in Java land, you're not used to writing tests for. Bringing Ruby into those sorts of settings was a real challenge. And at the time, and still, the MRI, the C-based Ruby runtime, is both slow and unpredictable. And that made bringing Ruby into the enterprise a real challenge. So I started looking around for a language that kind of gave me the best of all. Something that was very concise, very expressive, and at the same time was type safe and high performance. And I found Scala. And the thing that Scala was missing was it was missing a web framework. So, what did I do? I went out and wrote one. And when I came into the Scala community in November 2006, it was a very, very small community, very tight-knit. There were very few people who were outside of academia in the community. And now it's just a huge burgeoning community full of people from industry, people from, just Web 2.0 land, people from academia. Martin Odersky and the Scala team ran Scala Days, which was a conference over in Europe, which was part academic and part commercial. And they were so oversubscribed that a friend of mine who I wanted to get in, who was too late, I called Martin up and I said, Martin, can you get this guy in? And Martin's like, we're beyond anything that fire codes allow. Really, I do it for you, David, but we just can't do it. So that's what's happened over the last 3 years. And there's been a tremendous uptake with Lift. There's been a tremendous uptake with Scala. And I think that the uptake is for a reason. And the reason is that the language is the right intersection between what developers need to be productive and what developers need to be correct.
And I was actually going to start by asking you to describe a little bit better than what is Scala. We haven't had anybody on from the Scala project on the show before, so I guess you're the representative guy for the moment. So can you describe how Scala is different than anything that some other people might be more familiar with?
So Scala is a hybrid object-oriented functional language that compiles down to Java bytecode and is provides 100% of a superset of the Java object model, which means that any Java libraries that you have, you can use in Scala. It means that your Scala code runs at the same speed that your Java code runs at. So you don't have the interpreter problem, you don't have the slowness problem, you don't have the impedance mismatch problem that you have with some of the other JVM languages. So as a developer, you can pick up Scala, learn the syntax without necessarily having to learn the semantics, and program in Scala like you would program in Java. So that's kind of you can stick your little toe in the water if you're a Java guy. But Scala is also a functional language, which means that functions, chunks of code that can be invoked, are first-class pieces of the language. It means that rather than having an interface for doing foo and an interface for doing bar, one that comes to mind is the runnable interface in Java. Why have runnable when you can just pass in a function that does the thing? So rather than having all of these micro interfaces that have a single method, you just have functions. And creation of functions is syntactically a lot cleaner than the creation of an anonymous inner class. So if I created an anonymous inner class that implements runnable, I have to say new runnable, open paren, close paren, open brace, def, run, blah, 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 blah. And I've got about 5 lines of code to just say print hello world. In Scala, the compiler does the right thing, because if it knows that a particular parameter is supposed to be a function, and you pass in for example, if it's a function, zero argument function, and you just pass in a method name, the compiler knows that under the covers it's supposed to create an anonymous inner class that implements function that can be invoked. Well, that kind of thing, both the developer code conciseness and also the uniformity of having a single interface, the function interface. Well, actually, there are 22 of them. Function 0 takes 0 args, function 1 takes 1 arg, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. But the compiler takes care of that stuff for you. The having that uniformity means that the developer isn't thinking about all the translations between here's a code block and here's an anonymous inner class. It's like, oh, okay, here's a code block that I want to pass and just make it happen.
Is Scala also a full functional language like Haskell, where you basically have like immutable things that have to be passed through things in order to be changed?
Scala has, the Scala libraries have an immutable side and a mutable side. Okay, so you can select a mutable hash map, or you can select an immutable hash map. And the immutable one, the reference never the value that the reference points to never changes, which means you don't have to synchronize on it. You can have a cache of that thing and vend it out without making defensive copies. I mean, the most popular immutable data structure in Java land is string. You never have to synchronize on a string. You never have to make a defensive copy of a string. You get a string, you do stuff with it, and you don't worry about somebody else having a reference and changing that reference out from under you. So Scala has a whole bunch of immutable collections. It also has a whole bunch of lazy immutable collections. So you can say that I have a collection of, for example, a range of numbers from 0 to integer max. Well, the runtime doesn't materialize 2 billion integers in memory. It just materializes them as you need them. So you can basically say, I've got that whole range. Now find me all of the prime numbers in that range or something. So you're not going to have to materialize the whole range, pass that whole range into the prime number finder. You basically say, give me that range, filter on a function that says whether the number is prime or not, and you get something that runs in a reasonable amount of memory space.
Cool. So how does Scala then influence the way you as a web developer work?
The key thing, and this is one of the things that leads into one of Lift's core constructs, is you can associate a function on the server side with a GUID, a global unique identifier, on the client side. So rather than having named form elements where the developer chooses the name, the runtime chooses the name. So you have a text field over here, and the text field represents somebody's name. You have a variable in memory. When the form that contains the text field is submitted, a function is executed, and the value that was passed as the parameter for that form submission is then passed into the function on the server side. What that means is that you don't have replay attacks because you can't guess the GUIDs. What it means is that the developer doesn't have to worry about naming form fields on the client side or pulling apart the HTTP request. They say, when a form is submitted with this field in it, this is a function that you run. And what that gives you is, I mean, it's kind of a nice construct. It's almost a Visual Basic-ish construct. When you push this button, do this thing. You don't have to worry about registering for events or anything else. But what you also get is you get the ability to say, oh, this form is an AJAX form versus a standard HTTP form. It makes no difference at all. As long as the form comes in, the function is invoked. So the developer is removed from the abstraction of AJAX versus non-AJAX. The developer is removed from the, what did I name this thing? The developer and the designer don't have to agree on names. And it also means that if a form element was not presented in a form, you can't do parameter tampering and add the extra parameter and have the server side pull the parameter out because it exists. So there are a lot of really nice benefits. But the net is that it takes the developer away from the plumbing and lets them focus on the business logic.
So it sounds very model view controller style, which, at least in my experience, you don't really see a lot of that in many of the current web frameworks, at least not as clear as what you just noted. I was looking at the Lyft website earlier today, which looks really good, by the way. So kudos on that. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the documentation around the project, how someone gets actually started if they listen to you here and go, wow, that's exactly what I'm looking for. Where do they get in and actually get started using it?
So there's the first and most important part of Lyft is the community around it. The community is just a tremendous group of people. The community members, the committers, I mean, everybody is warm, friendly, and welcoming. So when people want to start with Lyft, the very first thing that they should do is they should go to the Lyft Google group and sign up. Off of the main lyftweb.net website, there's a link to a Getting Started guide. The Getting Started guide is actually based on Lyft 1.0. We're going to be releasing Lyft 1.1 next week. I'm sorry, Lyft 2.0 next week. Lyft 2.0, and we're going to update that, the contents of the Getting Started guide. But what it does is it walks you through building a simple to-do application with user authentication and AJAX. So you basically get a feel for the various different pieces of Lyft, depending on your kind of mindset. It should take you between 2 hours and 8 hours to complete the Getting Started guide, and it's going to give you about 70% of the tools that you need to build a Lyft application, to build a complete Lyft application. Very cool. Yeah, one of the things that I read when I was researching, I haven't used Lyft myself, so I had to go and look at what other people were doing with it. And one of the things I came across once or twice was that some of the documentation for 1.0 was a little hard to find or whatnot, and sometimes it was best just to go to the source of Lyft and see what it was doing. Is this something that you folks are working on with the upcoming 2.0 version? One of the things that we've been working on, it's not going to be addressed when 2.0 launches. We've been trying to understand what people mean by that statement. So there's actually a tremendous amount of raw documentation for Lyft floating around. There's the definitive guide to Lyft from A-Press, which is also an open source book project, so you can get the PDF online. Lyft, the number of comments and documentation lines per line of code in Lyft is higher than that of Rails. So there's a fair amount of per method documentation. The challenge with Lyft specifically and Scala more generally is that the methods taken as individual pieces are not nearly as meaningful as the concepts as a whole. And what we've not done a good job of is we've not done a good job of outlining the concepts. Okay, cool. So to give people as well an idea of what's really possible with Lyft, because it's a framework, right? And all frameworks, they need applications to actually shine. If you had to pick one application that's out there written using Lyft that you think really embodies, the strengths that you get from Lyft, what project would that be? Can you tell us a bit about it? Novell Pulse, hands down. Novell Pulse is a corporate business-friendly layer on top of Google Wave. So Pulse uses the Google Wave communications infrastructure, but layers on top the authentication and authorization stuff that Novell is famous for. So what you get is a real-time, real interactive session. It feels, using Pulse to me feels like truly using a desktop application. Pulse, the entire Pulse front end was written using Lift, and it's not yet available to the public, but there are a bunch of screencasts about it. I've been lucky to be a Pulse user. I think that it's probably the highest and best use of Lift. The most famous and coolest use of Lift, the one that I use every day, is Foursquare. I mean, dude, I go everywhere. I check in. I'm the mayor of 8 places.
Ooh.
And yeah.
Yeah, I use Foursquare all the time, too. So you're saying that when I'm hitting the Foursquare app on my iPhone or hitting the Foursquare website, I'm talking to a Lyft application somewhere then, right?
Yes, you are.
Wow,
so
that's cool.
Yeah. So Foursquare was 18 months ago when the initial version of Foursquare was done. They were using PHP. When they got just a little bit of traffic, they realized they needed to choose another framework. And they chose Lyft, and they did the entire port in about 3 months from PHP to Lyft. What was most interesting to me about the port was Rasmus Lerdorf, who used to be a security guy at Yahoo, who also invented the PHP language, has this whole suite of nasty things that he does to websites. And he did a tweet that said, Lyft is the first app, Foursquare is the first app that I've seen in a very long time that didn't have a single security vulnerability that I can find.
Wow. That's quite a lot.
Yeah. And Harry, who is the lead engineer over at Foursquare, who's a tremendous coder, he was coding for speed. He was coding to get it done and get it scalable. He wasn't thinking about security, but he got that as a side benefit. So he got concise. And if you take a look at some of his presentations, I mean, they promote Lyft better than I do. So he got concise. I mean, they've been able to do 50, 60, 70% per month growth. And they've been very successful with that growth with Lyft. And, it's, I think, been a pretty good experience for them.
I was going to ask about earlier you talked about the global UIDs. What brought to mind there is that means you'd have to have some sort of session affinity then to make sure that you came back to the same server, right? Because otherwise that's not going to work, right?
That's absolutely right. So you use Nginx as the front end. Okay. Nginx and Jetty talk session affinity really well. Okay. And Nginx knows what servers are up, what sessions are associated with which servers. And if we had about 3 hours, I could walk you through the whole mechanics of state. And the net is that any mildly interactive application has to keep state. It has to keep it someplace, and whether it's being kept on the application server or in the database, it still maintains someplace. The question is, how is that state serialized and deserialized? And when the state has to be deserialized manually, first of all, it's slower. Second of all, it's subject to more defects. And third of all, it's potentially subject to security vulnerabilities. If something unexpected is inserted into the session, if somebody knows what that thing is, then when you deserialize the session on another box, is that thing the right thing? Yeah. So, it's I have not seen a case where the stateless model has actually demonstrated scalability to the Twitter or Foursquare level of, basically Twitter had to rewrite their infrastructure to be able to push state away from the Ruby on Rails pieces. And yes, the pure front end is stateless, but they've got a ton of state sitting just behind it. So what's the downside of having the state sitting in the app server itself versus sitting behind it? Okay, so how do you migrate? How do you do hot code upgrades, that sort of thing? There's some minor things, but at the end of the day, I don't my observation and my experience with both stateful and kind of the stateless model is you don't really get the efficiencies that one would initially think about with the stateless model.
And one of the other big problems that you have with something like Ruby on Rails is that the primary means of data storage is ORM active record. How is there something like that ORM in Lyft, or is it some other mechanism?
Not just one thing like that. I think there are about 8. So when I started the Lyft project, my very first pile of Scala code ever was what is now Lyft's mapper. It's a clumsy active record style OR mapper. And you know what? It gets the job done for your first, 10 tables, and you want to throw something together over the course of a weekend. It's a good choice. We have a separate structure called record. So mapper is intimately tied to relational databases. Record is a persistence agnostic layer that holds the data, and it also holds the rules for validation, for form generation, and for other stuff, and the business logic itself. You can then mix traits, which are the equivalent of Java interfaces plus code or Ruby mix-ins. You can mix traits into your models and say this particular model with this particular trait is now stored in a relational database, it's stored in MongoDB, it's stored in CouchDB, wherever you want to store it. So the persistence piece becomes separate from the description of your data record and the associated kind of businessy logic parts of that.
Cool. What kind of strategy do you have for development and debugging? I mean, what happens when something blows up? Is it just the stupid backtrace in the window and then you've got to go dig up the source code, or what?
The optimal way to do Lyft development right now, and part of it is because until Scala 2.8 ships, which should be sometime in the next couple of weeks, the IDE integration between Scala and with Scala has been less than optimal. It's either print line debugging or using JRebel. So are you guys familiar with JRebel?
I'm not, and some of our audience won't be, so go ahead and describe it.
So JRebel is a tool that will dynamically reload the functionality of JVM classes as they change. So your cycle is start up your app server, edit your code, save your code. If your IDE does compile on save, then the save code gets compiled, the classes get changed on the disk, JRebel reloads the changed classes, and your app behavior changes on your next page load. So it gives you these, and then you use print line.
Yes. So that's the past. What's the future? What are you heading towards here?
The future is with full IDE integration, you just put a breakpoint in your code, you single step to it, and you inspect your variables, just like you would in a Java program.
Oh, okay. That's not so bad then. Cool. Also, I do want to play with devil's advocate. A little bit earlier, you did talk about the fact that, yes, Rasmus ran his suite against your Lyft programs, against Foursquare. But yeah, that suite is probably biased towards known exploits of things like Perl and PHP, and not so much necessarily about things like Java, in particular Lyft and Scala. So do you think there's still probably the potential for exploits there, but nobody has a rootkit for it yet?
Yes. There's no such thing as perfect security.
Okay.
So there exists, I don't know what they are, and as soon as I find out what they are, I'll fix them. But there exists security vulnerabilities in Lyft. One of the last one that I can remember is that Lyft has a textile parser. So it'll parse textile and turn it into HTML. And we were allowing certain on-click events and on-mouse over events, attributes to be included with the some of the tags that were forwarded. And what that allowed somebody to do is that allowed somebody to then insert JavaScript on the page. And once you can insert arbitrary JavaScript on the page, then you can do a cross-site scripting attack. But in addition to the GUIDs that Lyft has, Lyft also keeps the page around as XHTML. rather than keeping the page around as a string. So by default, all of your output is, all the strings that you output are actually automatically escaped, so that if you're taking user input and turning it around to, you're taking some user-generated content and then publishing it out to another user, if you put angle brackets or whatever in, they're going to be escaped correctly. And the developer doesn't have to think about that. So there's a whole class of cross-site scripting vulnerabilities that generally goes away. The GUIDs mean that the replay attacks generally go away. Because Lyft has a whole host of object to storage mapping choices, and by the way, it also supports the Java persistence architecture. All of those things, by default, do the proper escaping of parameters that are sent to the database. So a lot of the SQL injection attacks, if you use the OR mapping layers, go away. Right. In the places where you have handcrafted SQL, for example, there's actually a parameter that you have to pass called I have validated this query, and you have to put your initials in and the date that you validated it on. So what it means is in a security audit, you go through and you grep for all those things, and you look at each of the SQL statements and just make sure that, an additional 2 eyes or 4 eyes or 6 eyes doesn't see a security vulnerability in the manually created SQL strings. But
you don't see, you don't see that kind of commitment or awareness, towards security at that level of the framework very often as well. So I think that's very cool. You mentioned earlier that Scala has a real basis in academia, and that when you first came in, it was pretty much only academia. Is there some sort of, or what has that academic background brought to Lyft? And maybe you also talk a bit about how that's kind of melded with the community that's come around Lyft. I don't think most projects come from such a strong academic-only background.
Well, I should also point out that I've only taken 3 CS courses in my life. And I almost got thrown out of 2 of them for being a smartass. But then again, being a smartass is kind of like goes with the territory of being me. But what academia has brought to Lyft, first and foremost, is a really strong type system. So we think about Java as being statically typed. But what we don't think about in Java is the intersection of the collections, the Java generics, and types, and classes and subtypes and a whole bunch of other stuff. And what Scala has been able to do to make Lyft better is create the facilities for saying, if I have certain types and I want other types, here is a bridge between the two that the compiler will insert for me. And what it does is it means that we have date classes where we can literally say to space days space ago, and it creates a date for us that is 2 days prior to the current time.
Is the community around? Is the community around Lyft right now, the Lyft project itself, similar to Scala in that it's got a mix of academia and non-academia? Is it corporate involvement and community involvement? What is the mix there?
There's very little academic flavor in Lyft land. So there are a couple of other web frameworks for Scala, most notably the Scala Z project, which has much stronger roots in academia and pure functional programming. The Lyft community is much more a melange of Web 2.0 users and corporate users and, well, basically the corporate mavericks. So Tim Parrott, who's one of the Lyft committers, also works for a Xerox division called XMPy. And he's been subtly putting Lyft into as many of the XMPy apps, web apps, as possible.
Very cool. How big is the community around it? Do you folks have a conference or something you all get together at, or do you have some metrics for the numbers? Yep. We
have 2,000 people on our mailing list, or maybe it's like 1,960 or something like that. There are 40 committers. We had a Scala liftoff in 2008. The Scala liftoff in 2008 had about 80 attendees. We had one in 2009 that was about 90 attendees. Scala Days, which was a combination of Scala and Lyft, was 150 attendees, and we're currently planning for a similar number of attendees at the Scala liftoff we're doing here in San Francisco in September.
Those are some good numbers, and it sounds like it's growing, which is great. I was also curious, what's the licensing behind Lyft?
It's Apache. So,
and do you mind speaking to why you picked that as well?
Because Lyft is an open project. The value of Lyft is the community, not the code base. So if somebody wants to take the code base off and do something else with it, great, go ahead. If somebody wants to take it and do private patches to it because they need it for a project that they can't then turn around and put the patches out in public, great, go ahead. So I wanted to have a business-friendly license, and Apache seems to be the most business-friendly license that also takes into account some of the more modern issues like patents and that sort of thing. So the Apache license, I think, is the most sane and reasonable for building software that you intend businesses to use, and I wanted Lyft to be used by businesses.
Very cool. Yeah, it seems that that's a fairly good approach to it, I think, and I really like how you've put an emphasis on the values of the community, not just the source code. And speaking about that, what really have you learned? What can you take away from your experience with Lyft and as it's growing in terms of open source? And since you have it seems a good, strong commercial side to it, the interplay between those two things.
So it's really tough. It's a big, tough question. And there are a fair number of us in the Scala and Lyft community who are trying to figure out how to take what is now a critical mass of users, especially of business users, and provide them with more value, but value that they pay for rather than value that they receive just by contributing back to the community. And it's a tough, thorny question. Oracle has done a pretty good job of being able to take open source projects and monetize them, but Oracle has a tremendous sales force. So adding SKUs for Oracle is a pretty easy thing. Progress Software, I think, is one of the smaller players that has been able to take some of the Apache 2 pieces or Apache 2 licensed projects and roll either value add or code or support onto them and make a profitable business around it. But it's unclear as how to do that with Scala and Lyft and some of the other pieces in the Scala ecosystem at this point. On the other hand, one of the things that I've learned about open source is that community values and building the community, the values that you start with are the values that grow, and growing the community is important. So one of the values for me has always been to try not to say RTFM. And basically encourage people to answer the question of all comers, because I believe that if you answer the question of newbies and you get them to stick in the community, they'll turn around and realize the community norms are to answer questions of newbies, and that sort of thing feeds on itself in a real positive way. On the other hand, I think there's also a requirement for decision making. And some of the other open source communities that I've seen or been a part of are have the facade of a collective decision making, and we try to reach consensus in the Lyft community. But there have been times, and the times happen, I don't know, once every 2, 3, 4 months, where you have 2 really good proposals, and a decision has to be made. And so the role that I've taken is I'm the benevolent dictator for life in Lyft land. I'm the guy that gets to make the final decision if a final decision doesn't get reached by community or by consensus. And I think that's also worked out well, because when we haven't taken Lyft in the web MVC route, we've actually taken it more in a traditional MVC route, which is the small talk, the real meaning of model view controller from small talk land, rather than front controller as identified by URL, which is the more web MVC way of looking at things. And that's been a conscious choice. And in the beginning, there was a lot of pushback or tension about that choice. I think it's becoming more obvious to people now that it was the right choice. But back 3 years ago, it was a tough thing. And kind of having a little bit of linearity from me and a little bit of consistency from me, I think, has gotten over that road bump and allowed Lyft to evolve in the right direction.
Wow, certainly a lot of meat in that answer. I'm going to have to go back and listen to that 2 or 3 times now. You definitely said a lot of good stuff there. And you're just about to run out the door to go on a vacation with your family, so I don't want to take too much more time. I just want to ask, because you asked me to ask you, what have you learned about open source from your dog? I'm curious about what that question's about.
So 6.5 years ago, that long? Oh my gosh. I got a dog and went to dog training school, which is not about training dogs. It's about training people to communicate effectively with dogs. And one of the things that I learned about being a good communicator with dogs is you tell the dog what you want the dog to do, and you give it feedback for when it's successful. And I think that is a tremendously good recipe. It's not one that I'm always successful in implementing either with my dog or with the open source community. But I think that if I were to sum up kind of how to grow a community and how to evolve things in the best way that I could think of, that'd be it. Great,
cool. Hey, and I also I'm curious, I forgot to ask this earlier, but is this your day job or is this just a project that's a passion for you or what?
So I make money consulting around Lyft and around Scala. So, cool. But back 3.5 years ago, I had to take some jobs that weren't always Scala. Today, I take jobs that are exclusively Scala and primarily Lyft, and have fun doing them and have fun helping small organizations evolve themselves both technically and strategically to reach their goals.
That's great. And where can people find out more about Lyft?
www.liftweb.net.
Very cool. Very cool. I don't want to make you late for your vacation, so I'll let you go now. Thanks a lot for being on the show, David.
Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been just a whole lot of fun.
All righty. Thanks. That was David Pollack, who is the leader, benevolent dictator for life. Let's see if I can say that twice. Of the Lyft web framework, community participant, Gadfly, and committer to Scala. Very cool. Thank you, David.
Thanks.
So, Aaron, interesting community ideas there, huh?
Yeah, and who knew that your pets could be so informative and be a great source of inspiration for managing in communities. I think it's really interesting, though, that we're seeing more of these open source high quality open source web frameworks. I think a big topic right now in the community at large is free web services. Free isn't free. In fact, there was a huge thread just yesterday on Identica amongst a few of the open source luminaries on there about this exact topic. And I'm a big believer that we both need them, but we also need the tools to make them. And for me, I think that's what makes things like Lyft that make it easier to create high quality scalable services really exciting.
Well, especially when you look at the notion that, back in the early days of the web, 94, 95, 96, we had basically C and Perl and maybe a couple of other small solutions for this. And then sort of the commercial world took over with, even though it being in Java as sort of even Java was closed source back then. So Java as a base, but there was all these sort of commercial grade things. And those seemed to be the only things that could scale. We tried to do stuff with Ruby on Rails and earlier with things like Mod Perl to scale. But it's really nice now to see things like Lyft that seem to have, from the get-go, have that sort of design to really say, let's take this and make it big and make it possible to do some really useful things.
And make it secure. And I really appreciate how they've emphasized the need for speed when it comes to development. Because if there's anything that's lacking in, an open source project, it's usually the time people have to lay their hands on the keyboard and write the code. So if that can be made fast and efficient, so you write it once, it comes out well, and you don't spend a lot of time writing it that once, that's a huge boon. So if we can, see things like Lyft take off, who knows, maybe that'll be one of those stepping stones to bridging that gap.
But I really like the fact that Scala exists and that he's using it for this project. I don't know much about Scala except what I've read in preparation for the show, actually, right, in the last couple of days, actually, and real quickly. But I like that it actually makes the JVM useful. I mean no disrespect to Java people, but I don't know how they put up with what they do every day. It doesn't make any sense to me. When I code in Perl, it's like 3 lines of code. In Java, it's like 40 lines of code. Sounds like Scala puts it back at the 3 lines of code place, which is really I'd be okay with having to write only 3 lines of code again, even if it is going to the JVM.
You know, I'm in exactly the same place as you, exactly the same viewpoint of Java if I want to spend time on C++. But yeah, when I was doing my research for the show as well, I came across this, the same kind of inkling, and I think I'm actually going to check Lyft out and actually try something out with it for that exact reason.
Very cool.
So, very, very neat. Yeah.
Great. So I think what I want to do now is go over the upcoming guests. And I'm so embarrassed last week that I had the notes, but I forgot to put like what each project was about. And I added so many new projects to the list that I didn't remember what they were about. So now I have my full notes here. Someday they're actually going to hire me for this show, and I'm still auditioning. It's really crazy. So we have Anthony Bryan coming in next week. He's talking about MetaLink, which is a universal identifier for downloading things. So if it's whether it's a torrent or an FTP site or a GitHub or whatever, a repo, basically it's a universal way of marking that down and just to have your download client understand it and do the right thing for it. Michael Idemia is coming on the following week. He's talking about Escosia PBX, which is an embedded Asterisk distro, a 20 megabyte full Linux distro that's running Asterisk, so you can put it on a little embedded device. Is really cool. We have Guillermo Amaral coming on talking about KDE in Mexico. Actually, I think you know Guillermo, right?
I do. Yeah, he's a crazy young guy. Hopefully that show will be a lot of fun.
It should be a lot of fun. Yeah, I've actually met him in person. I spent a lot of time in San Diego, and he popped up. But actually, he was at Scale, so that's where I first met him. We also have then Thomas Cherryholmes coming to us, talking to us about Linux MCE. And again, I'm sorry I didn't know last week what it was. It's a home automation media server. So it should be a really nice little project there. So we've had similar things on in the past, but this is yet another take on that. And if the last ones didn't do well for you, this one probably will. Mark Phillips and Andy Gross are going to talk to us about React, which is a NoSQL database that's being used with some very large applications. Andy Hall just added to the schedule. Andy Hall, Achim Hassenmuller, I hope I'm mispronouncing that tolerably, is coming on to talk about VirtualBox. Now, this is the VMware-like product, the virtual machine product like Zen that allows you to run virtual software, virtual environment anyway. So really happy to get them on the schedule. Stephen Heminger is talking about Viata, which is a Cisco clone. So it would take your old Cisco router out and replace it entirely with free software. That's going to be really nice. Dan Scott and Mike Rylander talking about the Evergreen Open Library System. So we have some really cool people lined up. If you want to see the rest of the guests we have lined up or getting close to being lined up, twitch.tv/floss. There's a link there to the upcoming guest list. You'll notice that there's probably 200 names on the list. I tell you, like I say, every week I can go floss daily if I had the time for it, and still not get through that list yet. So it's going to be pretty cool. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Merlin, Merlyn on Twitter. I also got to say, just timely, don't normally do a timely piece here, but within the next week, Linux Fund, one of the other hats I wear, is going to announce something on their Twitter account. Linux Fund is the Twitter account, obviously, about a special giveaway regarding OSCON coming up. So please watch that. Aaron, where can we find you?
You can find me on my blog at aseigo.blogspot.com. You can find me on Identica, which is the Freeze and Freedom version of Twitter, under the Aseigo account.
Very good. Good. And again, I got to thank you for showing up at the last minute. We only put the show together in the last two days, so really appreciate you stepping up at the last minute to be my co-host for this week.
Not a problem. It was fun as usual.
Very good. And we're definitely going to have you back. We got a couple, actually, show lined up already, I think, with you on it. So we'll just have to have people guess when that's going to be, though. All very good. So any last thing you want to say to our audience?
Other than check out Lyft and get working on those Freeze and Freedom web services, not much.
Sounds good. So I'll just end with, as I always do, we'll see you next time on Floss Weekly.